Welcome to Refugee from Russia podcast. I hope you're doing great. Today, I want to talk about Circassians, and I have a guest who is Circassian American. Hey, Ark, how are you doing?
Good morning. I'm doing well. It's wonderful to be here.
So nice to have you. In very few words, because some people might not even know what Circassian is, tell us who you are and how do you explain the term Circassian to people who don't know anything about Circassians?
So, my name's Ark Natirbov. I'm actually the descendant of the first Circassians in America. And my grandfather was born in Turkey. My great-grandparents were born in the Circassian homeland, which is in the North Caucasus Mountains. My tribe is the Mahorsh. That is my tribe in both my tribe and my clan, because the Mahorsh are a very large clan but a very small tribe. I would explain the Circassians as being the indigenous people of the North Caucasus who speak the Adiga language. There are 12 different Circassian tribes, and the biggest part, or the biggest factor in recent Circassian history, was their genocide and expulsion from the North Caucasus, from their homeland, into the Ottoman Empire. So that's who I would explain Circassians to most people. Of course, if you're in America, you have to explain where the Caucasus is and the geography of
We will go
everything.
into that. Where were you born, Ark?
I was born here in Miami, Florida. My family has been in America for over 100 years. My family has lived for 4 generations in the state of Florida.
Okay. I would like to start with your grandpa. He was the first Circassian to arrive in the U.S.
Yes, so my grandfather and his family were the first Circassians to arrive in the United States and establish a Circassian community. My grandfather was born in Turkey, and him and his family came to America when he was still a very, very young child. They immigrated in the year 1923, so over 100 years ago. And my grandfather lived the American dream. He grew up in New York City, and he did a number of various exploits and feats for the Circassian community that we'll go over in this podcast.
Why did he come to the U.S., or his family came to the U.S.?
So it's a long story, if we can go into it. Initially, the majority of Circassians were expelled from their homeland in 1865 after the Circassian genocide. My family, however, survived the genocide and continued to live in their homeland until about 1920. 1920 was, of course, you had World War I before that, and my great-grandfather served in a North Caucasian unit in the Imperial Russian Army. And after World War I, of course, you have the Russian Civil War, the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War. My grandfather and many of his family members, they tried to establish an independent North Caucasian state, the North Caucasian Republic in the North Caucasus. And they also fought with, they were anti-communist, so they fought against the communists during the Russian Civil War and the Russian Revolution. And so because they sided against the communists when the communists took over Russia in the North Caucasus, they had to flee to the Ottoman Empire.
When his parents left, he wasn't born yet.
He was not born yet when his parents left. Now, there's some inconsistencies in where my grandfather was born. Most people say he was born in Turkey, and some sources say that he was actually born in the Crimea right when the White Army was actually evacuating. So he could or could not have been born when his family left the North Caucasus. But the story that I was always told, and the story that he told me, is that he was actually born in Istanbul after his family had fled the North Caucasus. So literally they left in, I believe the White Army evacuated, and many of the anti-communist forces evacuated from the North Caucasus and from Russia in 1920, at the end of 1920, and my grandfather was born in the beginning of 1921. He was born in February of 1921.
Coming to America, was it a choice or survival?
So it was essentially survival, but it was the best opportunity for their survival. They, of course, wanted to stay in the North Caucasus. That was their homeland. that was where they had their community, where they had their people. But of course, they couldn't go back to the North Caucasus because they were expelled. Many of my grandfather's family members who actually stayed ended up being executed and ended up actually being sent to camps out in Siberia because of their ties to anti-communism and to anti-Russian imperialism. So the choice to come to America, it was an opportunity that was given them because they were contacted basically by a U.S. naval officer who was visiting Istanbul, because at this time Istanbul was under the occupation by the Allies, because this was the end of World War I. He heard about all these officers who were Circassian and Georgian and from Dagestan, all these different officers who were there, who were anti-communist forces. And he met with many of these Circassians. He was very impressed by who they were, by their military knowledge. And so it was arranged for them to immigrate to America by this U.S. Navy officer.
What did his parents leave behind?
So his parents left behind basically their entire life. My family, our ancestry is very high up in the Circassian aristocratic system. So my grandfather's family were the chiefs or the princes of their tribe. That's why our village is named after us. That's why we come from the Al Natirb, and because we are the Natirbovs, right? So the princes or the prince nobles is the class that my grandfather's family came from. And so when they left land, they left their horses, many of their horses, they had to leave. Their riches, pretty much their entire life was left in the North Caucasus. Their tribe was pretty much annihilated. The Mahorsh were pretty much annihilated during the genocide. And so they pretty much left almost their entire family back in the Caucasus and back in Turkey when they came to America. If you can imagine, they were a very affluent family at that time. So they had multiple houses that they left. They had hundreds and hundreds of acres of land that they ruled over. And so it was a very hard thing for them to do, to leave all that and to come to America with nothing.
Did your grandpa ever talk about Circasian?
My grandfather, it was hard to find a time where he didn't talk about being Circassian, actually. He was very, very proud of his heritage. And there was almost not a day would go by where he wouldn't teach us children about something about what it meant to be Circassian. He taught me not just about what it meant to be Circassian, but he taught me about the other ethnic groups who live in the Caucasus. He told all the folklore, the stories of the people who lived in the Caucasus. And I remember the day that he taught me about the most important aspect of being Circassian, which is the Adiga Habsa. And it's a very core memory for me. We were on a walk with my grandfather, me and my family. And my sister, my younger sister, who was a little girl at the time, she asked my grandfather, she said, grandfather, what is your, she was just being a little silly, but she said, what's your favorite word? What's your favorite word, grandfather? And my granddad said, well, my favorite word is the Adiga Habsa. That's what my favorite word is. That's my favorite phrase. And so he explained to us what the Adiga Habsa was, and that it's the core basis for the Circassian value. It means basically the Circassian viewpoint or the Circassian way of the universe, right? And it involves being honorable, being hospitable, and being brave. These are like the core aspects. Honor is the core aspect of the Adiga Habsa. And I'm sure in our culture you have, a similar set of values, right? Every North Caucasian ethnic group has that same set of values, and they call it different things, but it's all very similar. So hospitality, bravery, and basically living as honorably as you possibly can is the core value of Circassian culture.
Your grandpa was Circassian Christian, is that right?
So actually, he was actually born into a Muslim family. So my grandfather was born into a Muslim family. He grew up as a Muslim, and then he raised his sons to be secular. And then my father actually became a Christian when he went to college. So he raised me and my family as Christians. Of course, the majority of Circassians are Muslim. There's a very small minority who are Orthodox Christian, and an even smaller minority who are Protestant Christians. But amongst our neighboring ethnic group, like the Abkhazians, who are very closely related to Circassians, their language is very similar to Circassian, even though it's not mutually intelligible. Abkhazians are about 50% Christian, but amongst Circassians, it's about 99% of them are Muslim, and then maybe 1% are Christian.
Before we talk about what it means for you to be Circassian, I know you brought a box with a lot of documents and
Absolutely.
photos. Let's go into it. Where would you like to start?
So let's see. I can start with these two photographs. This photograph right here is one of pretty much one of like the core photographs of my childhood and of our history. This photograph would always remain on our mantelpiece when I was a child growing up. I asked my mother who that was, and she would say, "Oh, those are your great grandparents. This is Islam Natirbov, and this is Shaharhan Natirbov. All right, this is my great grandfather, and this is my great grandmother. My great grandfather, as I mentioned, he's from the Mahorsh tribe, and my great grandmother, she's actually from the Shapshug tribe. Now, generally, Circassians marry people within their tribe, but you can't marry someone within your clan. And because the Mahorsh are both a tribe and a clan, he married someone who was outside of his tribe. So my grandfather is from my great-grandfather is from the village of Natirbov in the Adigayan Republic. And then my great-grandmother is from the village of, and I'm going to butcher this pronunciation because I'm not a native Circassian speaker, but she's from the village of Hatram Tok, which is a Shapshuk village. So if you'd like to look at that photo right there.
Thank you.
That photo was taken in the North Caucasus, I believe. It was either taken in the North Caucasus before they left, or it was taken right when they came to America.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Traditional clothes. The kinjal.
Absolutely. The kinjal, he has his pistol in his holster there.
We have one kinjal here on the table.
Absolutely.
So that is your grandpa's kinjal.
Not this kinjal, no. This kinjal was actually a gift of my parents. My parents gave this kinjal to me as a present because of how much I love Circassian culture. And so this kinjal was not my grandfather's kinjal. I do have photographs. I did show you photographs. We still have my great-grandfather's kinjal, but unfortunately I couldn't bring it today because it was locked in my family's display case at home. But we have photo of that kinjal. We also still have, you can't see it in this photo, but he's also wearing the traditional Circassian, the traditional North Caucasian sword, which is the shashka, which comes from a Circassian word, which means long knife. So he's wearing the kinjal, he's wearing the chucheska or the ze, which is the Circassian coat, with the gazir, which are the cartridge pockets, and then he's also wearing a Mauser pistol. And all of these weapons my family actually still has up at my uncle's house in Pennsylvania.
That's incredible. What else do we have there in the box? Can we?
I can show you.
Yeah,
So we
love to see.
Various photographs. This photograph is taken in the North Caucasus, and that is the women, the Circassian women of my great-grandmother's family. My great-grandmother is... I believe she's the second from the left on that photograph. And they had these cultural events in the North Caucasus where everyone would, of course, dress up in their traditional Circassian attire. And so we have a number of different
So beautiful.
photographs and
So
documents
beautiful.
in here. This book right here was written by my paternal grandmother, and is basically a documentation of the Circassians of the Circassian side of my family. So she has a number of different documents that she has collected, and it includes photographs and also includes the Ellis Island records from the day they immigrated.
From the day they arrived.
and it includes, things that you wouldn't even, be able to tell nowadays, their height, their eye color, different areas, various things like that. And I can tell you the exact date. This is from the SS Constantinople, sailing from Constantinople on the 8th of July, 1923, and
Wow.
arriving in New York City on the 1st of August of 1923.
That's incredible.
So that's the day my family arrived in America over 100 years ago. And so we can turn, and this entire section of the records from Ellis Island. And for those of you who don't know what Ellis Island was, it was the main port of immigration for the majority of immigrants who arrived in the United States during the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries. And you can find stuff like this has my grandfather, my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother, and of course all of the many of the other family members who also immigrated with them. So there were two different sides of the family who immigrated. There were, of course, the Natirbovs, and there were the Ulagais, and then there was also another side of the family who were the Garays. But they were all related. They were all related to each other because through marriage or through blood. So on this page right here, page 40, this is the page that has my grandfather and my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother on it. So my great-grandfather was 25 years old when he immigrated, and my great-grandmother was 23. So they were very young. And my granddad was 3 years old when he came to America. So you can look at that right there.
It's incredible.
His full name is Haji Mirat Natirbov because he was actually named after an Avar folk hero, who I'm sure you've heard of, who was who was a famous Avar folk hero who fought the Russians during the Russian-Caucasian War. And then Shaharhan is my great-grandmother, and then Islam Natirbov is my great-grandfather.
And this was compiled by your paternal grandmother.
Yes, this was compiled by my paternal grandmother, who was my father's mother.
That is incredible. Thank you to her.
So my great-grandmother was 23. My great-grandfather was 25.
She was born in 19.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. They were both born in the 1800s. Yeah. So my great-grandfather, Islam Natirbov, he fought in World War I, and he also fought in the Russian Civil War. He was actually only 16 years old when he first went to the front in World War I, so he was very young. And so he fought all through World War I on the Eastern Front, and then he fought all through the Russian Revolution and Civil War as well. And so he basically was fighting nonstop all the way from the time he was all the way from the time he was 16 years old to the time he was in his early 20s. So he was at constant war. He was a part of a North Caucasian unit called the Wild Division, which was made up of volunteers from the various North Caucasian republics. So it was officially called the Caucasian Native Cavalry Division. There was a unit for or a regiment for Circassians, a regiment for the neighboring Circassian tribes, the Kabardins, a regiment for Dagestanis, a regiment for Chechens and English people, a regiment for people from Azerbaijan. It was all compiled into one North Caucasian Cavalry Division. And so you had about an entire unit made up primarily of North Caucasian volunteers. And that's the unit that he fought all through World War I with. He was one of the only people in his cavalry division, in his entire division, to actually survive the entire war because of how great the Russian losses were on the Eastern Front during the First World War.
That is incredible. Thank you for sharing that. What else do we have in the box that you would like to share with us?
Well, I can go over a bit more about some of the photographs that are in here. We have, and if I turn to the back, we have, of course, pictures of Kirchuk Ulegai, who is my my great grandmother's brother, actually. This is who Kuchukula guy was. And during the when my family left the North Caucasus and went to Turkey and then went to America, he actually, instead of going to America, he went to Albania. And so that's why you have a Circassian man in an Albanian army uniform, is because he ended up going to Albania.
That is tragic. The brother and sister got separated.
They did. As far as I know, I don't believe they ever saw each other again. He ended up going to Albania, and then he actually moved to South America, actually, after the Second World War. What other photos do we have in here? We have a photo of my grandfather's cousin in here, if I can find it. And in it, he's about, when he's about 5 years old, my grandfather's cousin is wearing a Cherkeska. And his name was Azamat Natirbov. And he was also one part of that first Circassian immigration who came to the United States of America. Let's see.
Did any of your grandparents' siblings come here?
Yes.
Grand
Yes, some of
the
their
grandparents. No, the grandparents'
Yes.
siblings.
my great grandparents, my great grandmother's, many of her siblings came here. So there were cousins who immigrated to America in the same immigration, and both of my great grandparents actually, they had siblings who came here and who immigrated with them.
That this brother was the only one who decided to go to another
Albania.
country.
Yes, he was one of the only ones who decided to go to another country. Some of them stayed in Turkey. Some actually immigrated to Egypt and became involved with the Egyptian royal family. But the majority of my great-grandparents' family ended up actually coming to America.
Yeah, that is very, very, very tragic when families get separated like this during war, and then, like you said, they never see each other again. And yeah, breaks my heart.
Absolutely. There was, it was almost like my family went into diaspora. You know, the Circassian people go into diaspora, and this is true for the vast majority of Circassians. The Circassian people end up being separated, and in the same way, the Circassian families end up being separated as well. You know, they end up getting split apart, and somebody goes to, Jordan, somebody goes to Turkey, somebody goes to Syria, somebody goes to Egypt. And the Circassians, not just as a people, but individual families end up being split apart during the tragedies that have befallen the Circassian people. This is what I was trying to turn to, actually. In the Ellis Island Manifest, all these other Circassians are either the cousins or the siblings of my great grandparents. So Zizur Sharatlokov and Zagret Sharatlokov, Layla Natirbov was also she was a nephew, she was an adopted. She's basically the adopted younger sister of my great grandfather. And Tsar Natirbov was also a relative who immigrated with them. Kuchuk Natirbov was like my great-grandfather's adopted father, but that was actually his uncle. But my great-grandfather's parents died when he was younger, and so Kuchuk Natirbov actually ended up raising him. Fatima Natirbov, Muhammad Garay Natirbov, Zuleta Natirbov, Sultan Pramel Kadir Garay, another Kadir Garay, and Genghis Khan Garay was one of my grandfather's cousins. He was also very young when he immigrated. The Garay family were my great-grandfather's cousins, basically. So
all stayed in New York?
They all stayed in New York, or they moved to other places within the United States of America. So yeah, there are many other Circassians who were their siblings or their cousins who immigrated with them as well. And as you can see right here, if you want to see something funny, there were very few immigrants from the Caucasus. So right here in the Ellis Island records, they actually misspell the word Caucasus, and they spell it C-O-C. right down here where
Yes,
it's
I see.
circled. So yeah, they had siblings, and
And I see that there's some Russian instead of Circassian.
oh yes. So often the people at Ellis Island would end up just putting Russian instead of Circassian because that's one of the languages they could speak. They were very multilingual people. My great grandfather could speak anywhere from about 5 languages because he also learned German during the war, and many of them also could speak and read Arabic too. The Arabic script, of course, was the script that they were using at that time in the North Caucasus. So down here, if you look through this record, when it lists one of the languages that they can read, one of the Circassians actually lists that he can read Arabic because he, of course, had learned it in school.
That's awesome.
So yeah, it's a very, very interesting. We could go over this for hours and hours, but I don't want to take up too much of your time.
I think what your grandma did is incredible because otherwise this information gets lost and
Absolutely.
you wouldn't be holding it and we wouldn't be talking about it and we wouldn't even know about your family and how they ended up here. What else do you have that reminds you or gives you that connection with your ancestors?
Oh, there's so many things in this box. This box basically was compiled this box basically belonged to my grandfather. And so it's most of his family photos, and there's just so much in here. I can show you. This photo right here is my grandfather, Murat Natirbov, and El Mirza. El Mirza was his younger brother, and this was taken in New York, and that's them in their traditional costumes.
They brought it with them?
Yes, they brought their traditional costumes with them. Some of their costumes actually were donated to the New York Museum, or the Met, the Metropolitan Museum in New York. But they brought their costumes with them. Some of them brought their traditional weapons. And so they were able to partake in traditional Circassian culture and wear their costumes in New York City.
That's
that
incredible.
photo was taken in New York City, and that's my grandfather, Haji Murat Natirbov, and his brother, El Mirza. Here's another photograph. This is the photograph of the officers of my great-grandfather's cavalry unit. The cavalry unit was actually commanded by the Tsar's brother. And of course, there's a very terrible history between North Caucasian people and the Russian imperial families.
Let's take a pause here and mention that part of the history
Yes.
briefly.
So
What was the relationship between Circassians and Russians?
So,
That history.
to put it quite simply,
And why is it important?
it's so we'll start with the first question. To put it quite simply, the Russians destroyed the massive parts of Circassian culture because in the early 1800s, late 1700s, Russia began a system of expansion into neighboring lands. And one of the lands they wanted to take over was the North Caucasus. So for 100 years, the Russians invaded the North Caucasus, and that war culminated in the Circassian genocide, which was the systematic expulsion and extermination of Circassian people. That is when the vast majority of Circassians were expelled to the Ottoman Empire, and millions of Circassians died. Not just Circassians, also. Other North Caucasian groups were also affected. Avars were expelled, and there was a great, slaughter of Avar people. There was a massive expulsion of Chechens. There was, but the people who were most affected by the Russian invasion were the Circassians, and that's because the Circassians lived along the Black Sea coast, and so the Circassian people could receive supplies from the outside, and so they were able to actually fight a longer guerrilla war against the Russians. The Circassians also were the largest ethnic group in the area at that time, and also their land was the most strategic. The reason why Russia invaded the North Caucasus in the first place was to gain access to the Black Sea and to create a buffer zone between the Ottoman Empire. And that Black Sea region was controlled by the Circassian tribes. So that's why the Circassian tribes were annihilated. Now, this cavalry division was actually a bit
I
of
like
a...
how there's a horse in the center.
There is. This cavalry division actually has a controversial history because essentially one of the reasons why the Imperial Russians decided to form a cavalry unit of North Caucasians is basically so that they could essentially send these North Caucasian fighting men to the front, and they would die fighting the Germans, and then they wouldn't end up, resisting the Russians, essentially. So it's similar to what is actually happening nowadays in the North Caucasian republics with Ukraine, where they will recruit. There will be propaganda trying to incentivize and encourage North Caucasian young men to fight in Ukraine, taking advantage of the martial aspects of North Caucasian culture. And that is essentially Russia's way of controlling the North Caucasian republics and eliminating these fighting men who could pose a problem to them. So that cavalry unit sustained massive losses, and that was just, I essentially see that as one of the ways that Russia was trying to control the North Caucasian people.
How did they end up being a part of a Russian unit with the tragic history that their ancestors went through?
So the way they ended up being part of a Russian unit is it had been 60 years since the genocide. And it became almost a cultural belief. It's a cultural belief that you should fight if you're a North Caucasian man. Like, that's the cultural belief. And why they ended up fighting for the Russian Imperial Army is honestly something I have tried to explain, but it's very hard to explain. Because it was a volunteer division. It wasn't like something that they had. They weren't forced. They weren't recruited. They weren't conscripted. My understanding of it is one of the reasons actually with this North Caucasian division is the Russian Imperial Army actually offered amnesty for people who had, one of the ways they recruited is they pretty much offered amnesty for people who had fought against the Russian Empire, like Abreks. They pretty much forgave Abreks if they fought for the Russian Empire, basically. So that's one of the ways they actually filled up this division, in a similar way that Russians nowadays will send people to the front with trumped up charges.
You know what you're making me think of? Right now in Russia, prisoners have a choice.
Exactly.
If you want to get out of prison, you go fight, you survive, you come back, you're a free man.
Exactly. That's exactly what they did. People who maybe were wanted by the Russians for blood feuds or maybe even trumped up charges, the Russian Imperial Army basically said, if you join the Wild Division, if you join the North Caucasian Aboriginal Cavalry Squadron, you will pretty much be a free man when you come back.
If you survive.
If you survive,
that
yes.
makes the word volunteer now have a different meaning.
You were volunteered.
Exactly.
You volunteered.
You volunteered.
Also, my great grandfather, when he joined World War I, he was extremely young. He was 16 years old. He had just turned 16 years old when he first went out to the front.
That's crazy. Nowadays, people when they're mid-20s don't know how to turn the dishwasher.
Yeah, it's true.
He went to fight at 16.
It was, and I heard stories about his experience during World War I from my grandfather. And it was, war is hell, to say the least. So it affected him greatly. He lost many relatives because many of his relatives joined as well.
I always wonder what happened to the Circassian and Caucasian women when their men were sent to die in World War I and World War II. Who took care of them? And did Russians do anything to them after that? Because they are very vulnerable with their men being out, fighting for the country.
Yes.
And, so it just made me think of that.
Yes. They had to be, North Caucasians are probably one of the most resilient people in the world. So both the men and women are incredibly brave and incredibly resilient. But I can't imagine the horrors that both the men and women went through during this time. And subsequently, after World War One, when you had the Russian Civil War and all these various factions, the Russian Civil War was the highest death toll of any civil war in history. Over 8 million people died during the Russian Civil War from starvation, from murder, from all these horrible things. And so it was heartbreaking, to say the least. The things that happened to them. Some of my great grandmother's female relatives were actually sent to prison after the Russian Civil War because of their anti-communist activity and the fact that they were connected to. There was a lot of also the communists had a lot of very anti-religious policies. And so the Circassians, being a Muslim people, suffered religious persecution at the hand of the communists, and also they suffered political persecution just for being another ethnic group.
This would not be an exaggeration. It is a miracle that there are still Circassians in the world.
It genuinely is, because the Circassian people have gone through. I mean, we first had one of the first modern genocides in history.
The term ethnic cleansing came from the Circassian genocide.
Absolutely. And even people who were living as contemporaries at that time, the English, were actually watching, and they actually, there are instances of the English at that time referring to the war that Russia was doing in the North Caucasus as an extermination. So we have contemporary reports from viable sources, from very, I guess you could say, trustworthy sources that are calling it a Circassian genocide. And if you just look at the numbers, the Circassian people, they first, went through that genocide. They went through another great expulsion at the end of the Russian Civil War. And even the Circassians who have fled the genocide and have lived in the Middle East have experienced, great hardships. They've experienced hardships under Bashar al-Assad's regime. They've experienced expulsion from the Golan Heights after Israel occupied the Golan Heights in 1967. And so they've experienced persecution at the hands of the Turks when they were living in the Ottoman Empire because they weren't Turkish. And so the number of Circassian tragedies that have befallen my people, it is, the right word is miracle that they actually still have survived and kept their culture alive.
But how are you guys still alive?
I would just call it, first off, the grace of God, that the Circassians are still alive. Grace of God, and the resilience of the Circassian people to preserve their culture. The traditions of the Circassians to pass down that generation, that culture, that value, from father to son, from grandfather to daughter, to pass down that culture through generations. That is how the Circassians have still survived. But we are still a dying people, I would say, because we don't have our own nation. So the Circassians are still alive, but we are a dying people. Without a Circassian nation or a majority Circassian republic even, I would say that the Circassian people are still on their way to extinction. Because, there's just, it's not sustainable, the kind of situation we're in, because our people are so divided between Jordan, Turkey, Syria, Palestine, the North Caucasus homeland. We're such a divided people, and the number of Circassian native speakers, the number of people who still speak the Circassian language, it's dwindling by the day, by the generation. Every generation has, less people who actually can speak that language. Some of the dialects of Circassian, like Uzbek, are extinct at this point. Some of the tribes, like my tribe, the Mahorsh, almost extinct completely. So we are still alive, but we are on the endangered species list, to say the least.
Before I switch to you and talk about how the culture impacted you and what it means to you, is there anything else you would like to share about your grandpa?
So my grandfather, I could share a lot. He when he came to America, his life in New York City was very typical of many immigrants. They lived a very poor lifestyle. His family worked
After being very rich.
after being very rich and wealthy. Yes, they left all their riches in lands and houses in the North Caucasus, and so they lived a very poor lifestyle. They didn't have a whole lot of money, but they did have that value, the value of being Circassian, the Circassian Habza, which was, guiding their life and guiding their actions. So he wasn't wealthy materially growing up, but he was very rich in the kind of values that his grandparents bestowed on him. And that is something, though, that, through the generations kind of is becoming lost in Circassians in America. Especially I saw it in my family where we start to lose that Circassian culture. He grew up in New York City in a very poor lifestyle, as I mentioned. And his first job was actually working as in a match factory. Like a number of different immigrants, he worked in a factory as a child and as a teenager. And then during World War II, he actually joined the United States Marine Corps. And so he was in the Pacific during the Second World War. Many of his family members actually ended up joining during World War II the United States Intelligence Service, the OSS, because of their value of being people who could understand Russian and understand Turkish and understand a number of different Eastern European languages. So because his family ended up joining the OSS, he was able to, after the war, because of the GI Bill, he was able to get a very good education. And then he was actually able to work for the U.S. government. So he worked overseas in the diplomatic service for about 40 years. And he ended up traveling the world in diplomatic service to the United States of America.
Did he go back to Russia?
He did. He actually went back as a diplomat in the 1980s.
Wow.
So he lived in Moscow in the 1980s, in the mid-1980s. And my father actually lived in Moscow as well. And of course, my grandfather, he could speak Russian fluently, with the North Caucasian accent, as people have. And so that was very valuable to the United States at the time. So he ended up going back to Russia, and he actually ended up going and visiting the Circassian homeland during the 1980s. So he visited his homeland. He visited the lands and the houses that his family had previously owned that were taken away by the Russians. He visited various Circassian villages, and I've actually met Circassians who say, "Oh, my father actually met your grandfather when he visited the North Caucasus, when he visited Adygea, the lands of the Adygea, in the 1980s."
Your dad also lived in Moscow, right?
He did, yes.
Did he speak Russian?
My dad could speak a tiny bit of Russian, but he was raised, as an American, so he could not speak Russian. My grandfather, though, was fluent. He could also, of course, speak Adiga. And, speaking Russian as a Circassian is unfortunate. It's the reality that Circassians know Russian, but that's not our native language. If anyone is not familiar with Circassian culture, our native language is not Russian. Our native language is Adygibze, the Circassian language. The native language of ours is not Russian. So if you're watching the UFC and you watch Khabib Nurmagomedov, or the native language of ours is, of course, Avar. So they speak Russian as a lingua franca, but that is not our native language.
At what age did your dad live in Moscow, and when did he leave?
So my dad lived in Moscow in the mid-'80s. And so my father was born in 1961. So he would have been in his mid-20s when he left. He lived in Moscow for a couple years in his mid-20s, and I believe he left in 86. So he lived in Moscow for about I believe 2 years in Moscow.
So your grandpa's dad, was he married to a Circassian woman?
My grandfather's dad, yes, Islam Natirbov, my great-grandfather,
Yeah.
he was married to a Circassian.
Okay.
So
And then your grandpa,
those are my great grandparents. So
Okay.
they're both Circassian.
both Circassian, and then your grandpa.
My grandfather actually didn't marry a Circassian woman. He married an American woman because at the time there were no other Circassians in America.
Yeah, I imagine that would
Yeah.
be very hard unless you travel to Turkey or Syria or Golan
Exactly.
Heights. I see. Okay. And when you heard those stories as a child before you even understood what Circassian is, could you have known how much this would impact you now as you sitting and talking about Circassia and your culture?
As a child, I didn't quite know how much it would impact me, how passionate I'd become about Circassian culture. But even as a child, though, I felt more of a Circassian identity than my siblings because that is just something that I loved so much. I was fascinated by the clothes and the photographs of my great grandparents. I was fascinated by the story of the Circassians, how they had fled the North Caucasus on horseback and by ship after the Russian Civil War. I was fascinated by the cultures, the other cultures of the North Caucasus, by the folklore that I heard about Shamil, about Haji Murat, about the Circassians who fought the Russians. So I had some idea of how it would affect me, but as a child, before I even understood what it meant, I don't think I had any idea how passionate I'd become about preserving Circassian culture and about learning about who my grandfather's people and who my people are.
When did you start understanding your dad's heritage, your grandpa's heritage? At what age you realized, oh, I'm actually Circassian American, or that is my first identity, Circassian, and then I'm American?
I'd say that it was something that grew with me, right? As I grew older, the there's a Circassian identity kind of grew with me, right? I always knew that I was Circassian, but I didn't quite know what that was. I thought that the Circassian people, I didn't have a whole lot of knowledge about who Circassians were because the only Circassians I had ever met were my immediate family and my cousins, right? I think as I became a teenager, though, you normally, you form your identity when you're a teenager. I think as I became a teenager, and people would always ask me where's your family ethnically from? Where's the name Natirbov from? And I could explain that more and more. And after I got onto, started using the internet, I started researching and I started realizing, oh, there are actually other Circassians in the world. I'm not the only one. And so I feel like I've always told people that I was Circassian. Like that's always been the ethnic identity I've had. But I feel like when I was a teenager, 13, 14, 15 years old, that's when that Circassian identity really became solidified. And that became, the identity that the people I most closely identified with.
What values do you know you carry because of your grandpa?
Well, I feel like I carry I try to live by many of the Circassian values that are taught in the Adiga Habza. Now, the sad thing about, being assimilated into American culture is that you lose a lot of those values with every generation. You lose more of those values. But the hospitality, I love the Circassian hospitality, just the reverence you have for guests, the respect that you have for people of the opposite gender, the bravery, the bravery, the resilience, the honesty. I have so many of the values that my grandfather taught me, that this is how a Circassian lives. A Circassian never refuses his guest anything. A Circassian isn't afraid of anything. And a Circassian always tries to speak well and tries to present himself in an honorable and the right word would be in a formal manner. I try to live by those values taught by my grandfather, and I fall short all the time. But I try to believe that I make my grandparents and my ancestors proud.
What struggles did he pass down, intentionally or not?
Well, you know, amongst Circassian people, um, there's there's a number of different struggles that the Circassian people deal with. Um, I feel like one of the struggles that he probably passed down unintentionally is just losing your culture, you know, because my grandfather, even though he was, fully Circassian, he couldn't speak Circassian as well as his parents could.
Mm.
And then my father cannot speak Circassian at all. And then I barely know a word of Circassian. So just, the loss of your culture is something that, has been passed down through the generations, even though we've tried to preserve that Circassian culture, and I'm working very hard to try and revive and preserve that Circassian culture. You also lose your culture as you assimilate to other to the melting pot, as you melt into the melting pot of America.
Do you feel a responsibility to remember or preserve Circassian culture?
I do. Yes, I feel like this is something that I was meant to do. I feel like that, my ancestors struggled so hard to try and preserve the Circassian culture. They fought, they spilled their blood, they died, they were subject to genocide. Every single thing that my grandparents did to come to America and to work this hard, every drop of blood they spilled, every drop of sweat that fell from their brow, everything was to preserve this culture and their people. And so I feel like, as their descendant, it's my duty as a Circassian, and it's the duty of every Circassian, actually, to try and preserve your culture, to try and learn your language, to learn traditions, and to pass on those traditions to the next generation, to pass on those generations the songs, the folklore, the language, the dance. And if you don't know how to do these things, and you're Circassian or of the Circassian descent, learn how to do these things, There's a Japanese man, actually, who knows how to dance Circassian dances extremely well.
Wow.
So if he can do it as
Not
somebody
random at
who's
all.
if he can do it as somebody who's not Circassian at all, then any Circassian should
You have
learn
no
how.
excuse. Yeah,
Yeah,
if
you
you're
have no
Circassian.
excuse at all. So learn the language, learn the dances, learn the culture, and live according to the Adaga Habsa.
If your grandpa was alive today, what would he say about your life?
I would like to imagine that my grandfather would be proud of me, but back when he was still alive, because he lived, and according to the Circassian tradition, he lived to be over 100 years old, which a lot of people in the North Caucasus are very, very long lived. I think you're the youngest Dagestani I've ever met, actually.
Yeah,
But-
yeah. We are the organic food that we eat. Actually,
it's-
really
it's-
helps with the longevity
It's the organic food, and it's the kefir and the yogurt. I'm convinced.
and the air.
The air,
And
the
the
fresh
mountainous
mountain air,
air.
and being able to work and exercise in the mountains.
Mm-hmm.
So in true,
Well, exercise is a stretch. You just do the work that you need to do in the fields, collect the potatoes, the walnuts. Basically do the agricultural stuff. But yeah, sure, work out.
yeah. When you're on a farm, that is your exercise. Working,
Yes, it is.
There is no
Yeah.
gym. The
There is
farm
no-
is your gym.
My God, there is no. I mean, my uncle, he made a gym in the village. I remember growing up seeing it, the handmade gym. It's like
That's incredible.
I wish I had a phone at that time to take a picture.
That is absolutely
That was
incredible.
great.
I learned so many wonderful things from you. Like, you are such a wonderful. It's so wonderful to hear about Avar culture.
Thank you.
Because the Avars were probably one of the most impactful people on North Caucasian culture, in my opinion, because
Yeah.
of Imam Shamil.
Because of him. But at the same time, hearing you say your grandparents knew the language, your grandpa not as well, your dad not at all, and you also struggle with that. Hearing that makes me very scared for my language and for my people too, because there's only 1 million of us, and I can already see. I mean, I speak it, my niece doesn't. And when my mom and my grandma are no longer here, I will probably feel the same way, like a responsibility to pass it down to my kids. But it's this support system, the community that you actually need for that. You know,
Yes.
who you speak to. Sure, my child can learn the language on her own, on his own, but they need a community, people that they speak with, so that they feel that this language is cool and accepted, and they have people to speak that language with, and they don't feel like, you know, weirdos being the only ones that speak that language. Because no matter how accepting any country is, you still will have this, you know, you will have dominant cultures in that culture. Like here,
Absolutely.
Hispanic culture is dominant culture
Yes.
here. In other parts, it's just white American culture is dominant. And then when you are such fragile group of people and you don't have the community, oh, that makes me scared. Makes me scared to think about my future, the future of the kids I'm gonna have in the future, all of that. Because if we don't preserve, if we don't talk about the culture, if we don't preserve the language, most importantly, one of our generations will be the end of it,
Yes.
and then we are no longer, you know, we're forgotten people.
Absolutely. And you know, it might be that, and if things don't go as we are trying to make them go, you know, in 50 more years, 100 more years, it could be that our people are extinct.
Yeah.
And that's so important, you know, to pass down, especially, you know, your culture as an Avar is much better preserved than Circassian culture, you know, but it's so important, and that's very it's very scary to hear that in Dagestan the Avar people are losing their language. Is that just because of like the prevalence of Russian, or
It's also because there's so many dialects as well.
Yeah.
There is, of course, the one language
Yeah.
of the box. So the language that Rasul Hamzatov spoke,
yeah
Gamzatov. But that's not the language most people know. They know
Yeah.
the language of their village. They know the dialect
Yeah.
of their village. And Avar has 19 dialects.
Wow, that's incredible.
Within that same dying language, you have 19 dialects.
And how mutually intelligible are the languages between, I mean, how are the various dialects of Avar?
I will say there are some dialects I can understand, but
Yeah.
there are other dialects I won't be able to. Maybe 30% of what they say I can understand, but the 70%, which is the majority, I don't understand,
That,
which is very sad. And you know, I hate to bring this up, but this week twice I heard people say that thanks to communism and what communism did to China, Chinese has a standardized language
Yes.
across the board.
yes.
So I just mentioned this as an example of how something bad, I guess, turned into something good without no political connotation
Yeah.
behind it. But I'm thinking for Avars, there has to be a standardized language. There has to be one, at least, dialect that everybody knows and speaks, and then they can have their own little dialects. Because otherwise, with people being spread because of the war, so many
Yes.
people left the Caucasus. People live in Turkey as well. There is our Turkish community there. Now, like, you know, I live here and there's other Avars here. We are going to lose our language. The next generation, especially of Avars that live here, will not speak it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It's a fact at this point. Unless something very drastic happens that standardizes the language and creates a movement. I mean, frankly, people need it to be a trend for them to jump on it and actually spend time on learning the language and brainstorming. Maybe there's another idea that, you know,
Yeah.
you don't need a standardized language, something else. I don't know.
A standard literary language. You know?
Standard literary language that people know, because we already have it. We do
Yeah.
have standardized literary language.
Isn't it called it's called like the army language, right?
The army.
In Avar. I heard that it was called like the army or the military language because it's the language that the Avars would speak when they'd all get together and, like, you know, go to war.
I haven't heard of that.
Yeah, maybe it's
Maybe.
if you haven't heard it, then maybe then I'm
I also
definitely
don't.
wrong,
I mean,
you know?
I might not know that. I might not be educated about that. When I have something I want to add. When the interview ends, what is one thought you want people to remember or come away with?
What is something I want people to remember? I want the Circassian people who are listening and everyone actually who's part of an endangered culture. And even if you're a Palestinian and you're not living in your homeland, or if you're Circassian, you're not living in your homeland, if you're any people group who's living in diaspora, and if your culture is in danger of dying out, I'd want them to remember to not give up, to remain resilient as their ancestors were resilient. I want them to know that preserving their language, preserving their culture is worth it. And for the non-Circassian speakers, the non-North Caucasian people who maybe are not familiar with who Circassians are, I want them to become familiar with the cultures, the rich culture of the Circassians and of the various people of the North Caucasus. I want them to be able to say, next time someone calls Habib Nurmagomedov a Russian, I want them to be able to say, oh no, he's Avar. I want them to be able to spread some knowledge about what it means to be Circassian and what it means to be from this wonderful region where we call home.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your family story. Yeah, this was amazing. We have a lot of work to do as representatives of our communities. And I hope and I pray that we never lose hope and never lose motivation to keep going, because we have a responsibility to ourselves, to our ancestors who, well, didn't die for nothing. That's definitely something we have to keep in mind.
Absolutely. If the Circassian language dies out, or if the Avar language dies out, that is us losing.
That's the ultimate
Right.
defeat.
That's the ultimate defeat. The Russians might have officially conquered the North Caucasus in 1865, but they haven't won yet. Right?
Yeah.
We have not been defeated yet. The day we're defeated is when the last Circassian speaker dies, when the last Avar speaker dies, when the last Avar child doesn't know their culture and can't explain what it means to be Avar, or when the last Circassian cannot explain what it means to be Circassian. That's the day we're defeated. All right? Until that day, we will fight to try and preserve our culture and try to revive the very rich culture of the North Caucasus, so that the blood of our ancestors is not spilled for no reason.
Exactly. Well said. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been an
Thank you.
absolute honor to be on your podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.